This is Metabolic Mastery, a core medical technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by Core Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert, and this is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we're going to be talking about some misconceptions and myths around VO2 max. There's a lot of them out there, and so we're going to go through just a few. But I think this is helpful because, as we've talked about before, VO2 max has really become a buzzword. There's been some influencers that have really popularized it, which is great, right? Getting people more interested in their physiology and what they can do to live better longer is fantastic. But with that, a lot of misconceptions pop up, and that sometimes directs focus away from some of the things that matter most.
Yeah, absolutely. And this happens every so often. I would say every 5-6 years, another wave of like zone 2 becoming popular again, or VO2 max becoming popular again. And this time around, I really appreciate it so much more because of the breadth of popularization of it, so that it's getting out to a lot more people. We've got a couple, famous high-level influencers that are talking about this, that have probably better credentials. Within the running community, it pops up every so often. But yeah, every time the wave of zone 2 becoming popular, VO2 max becoming popular, there come along with that a lot of misconceptions, or people that try it but without all of the information, or they kind of do it somewhat incorrectly. And so then some of the misconceptions are that it didn't work, or it doesn't give the results that they were hoping for, and things like that. And so that's some of what is born out of not fully understanding what it all means, and still trying to use some of that data. And so hopefully we'll clear a bunch of that up today.
Absolutely. All right. So myth 1, VO2 max is just about breathing or lung capacity.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that we get this is that you do a VO2 max test and you're just like, oh man, by then I feel out of breath, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so separating that from what's happening perceptually versus what's happening physiologically, I think will be helpful. And kind of bottom line is that for most individuals, unless you have a known clinical condition or you're at the elite level, typically lungs are not the limiting factor.
Yeah. Often not. And so it's not just your lung capacity or how much air that you can take in. That's what a lot of people believe, that VO2 max is just how big your lung volume is, which plays a factor and can allow some people to have higher volumes at a relative fitness level compared to other people, and things like that. But this misconception leads to a lot of kind of excuses of like, oh, I just have bad lungs, or I just don't have this or that breathing exercises alone can solve a low VO2 max, that I just need to do breathing exercises and get my lungs and diaphragm and all that stronger. And it's not the full story, because VO2 max is measuring our body's ability to use oxygen, which encompasses a lot of different systems within our body. And so it's not just measuring lungs, it's measuring muscles, blood vessels, and lung capacity, ability to exchange oxygen at the lung, ability to exchange oxygen at the muscle, our neuromuscular system, so how our nerves are interplaying with that and telling our muscles to contract. Like there's a lot of depth to how that works, even the mitochondrial function of those muscles.
Yeah. Well, I love that you bring this point up, because as we've talked about before, exercise really is the poly pill, right?
Oh yeah.
It hits every system. And so there's place for, our cardio exercise, so-called, and resistance training. Both of those are working multiple different parts of the system, and helping coordinate that. And so, I think sometimes we think it's like, oh, cardio, like, oh, just my heart, right? I'm doing good things for my heart. But really it's doing good things for, the heart, the lungs, that whole system, the musculoskeletal system, like
Right.
all those things are working in conjunction. And so that's really important.
Well, and it's one of the reasons why, if you weightlift, why you need to do cardio too. And if you do cardio, why you need to weightlift too, is because those systems do interplay so much that weightlifting is going to help you improve in your cardiovascular training as much as cardio is going to help you improve in your muscular fitness.
Yeah.
Giving you more endurance, more capacity to do more work so you can see bigger gains. They both interplay off of one another. So it's not one or the other, it's both are beneficial. And so the key like we talked about, because this is testing so many different systems within our body, and like you said, lungs are not often the limiter unless there's a known diagnosis. COPD is clearly going to be a limiter in
Yeah.
your function. But so that's often what happens is we misunderstand what the limiter is for any individual, or kind of where their deficits are. And so then we choose the wrong intervention or the wrong pathway for getting them better. And so we have to make sure that we're not just blaming it on VO2 max. And so you better go out and if you have a low VO2 max, you better go out and just do sprint intervals all the time, which wouldn't be bad, but it may not be the only solution.
Right. And it may not be the right solution for you at that given
At that time, yeah.
Right.
Yep.
We sometimes have to train, right? To be able to do those higher intensities, we need to kind of tune up the system to be able to do that without, breakdown, injury, things like that. And so with this, as we mentioned, multiple parts of a system. So we've got the oxygen intake, and so lungs are a big part of that. But then we've also got oxygen transport. And so that's going to involve our capillaries. That's going to involve how much blood volume we have. That's going to involve our cardiac pump.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, what do the highways look like to carry oxygen to where it needs to get to go?
Yeah.
That's typically the biggest limiter for most people.
Right.
And then you have at the cell, right? How am I utilizing that? Is it getting into the mitochondria? Do I have sufficient density and efficiency of those mitochondria? But that's one of the big things that we change with regular cardio exercise, with elevating VO2 max as a part of that, is that we just get a better highway system throughout our body for transporting oxygen where it needs to go, so that it can be quickly utilized.
Right. Well, and like we say with a lot of things, increasing your VO2 max number is typically the result of doing a lot of other things right in your training. Just training for VO2 max probably isn't going to get you as big of a result or as long-term of a result, or is more likely to lead to injury, fatigue, and burnout than training the right way and letting the VO2 max be the natural, the increase in VO2 max be the natural result of just quality training.
Yeah. Well, and so being able to look at some of those different parts ends up being really helpful.
Yeah.
So we recorded an episode a few weeks ago with Daniel Cronbach where we talked about some of the different limitations,
Yeah.
and how we can identify, some of the different systemic limitations. So a great example of that is VO2 pulse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's your VO2 per heartbeat, and we want to see that track pretty linearly with heart rate over time.
Right.
And so if we're seeing inefficiencies there, it's like, okay, there's probably something up with some part of that transport system, right? Do we need to strengthen the heart? Do we need to train in such a way that we're going to drive adaptations to that capillary system? Things like that. It can help us to see, like, what is the primary limiter right now? How do we address that? And that often takes care of some of the downstream limitations.
Right. And so that allows you to take further investigation of, do we have a muscle problem, or a metabolism problem? Do we have a lung function problem? It allows you to look at, the total volume of air being moved, or the total number of calories being burned, or, strength and stability and things like it. It just helps you to ask those better questions and dive a little bit deeper into where is this limitation actually coming from, so that we can make the appropriate adjustments. And so how does the KORR technology help us to do that? That's one of the things that I love with a cardio coach, is that I can dive into some of those things, looking at those factors like the lung volumes, looking at that tidal volume, or just there's a series of different data points that are collected there, and looking, is that the limiting factor? Is that tracking, or is it the metabolic side of things?
Yeah.
Are we not able to burn enough calories, just total, which signals more about either mitochondrial efficiency or muscle mass itself, just not having enough muscle to be a good sink for burning calories. And so then, it leads to further investigation. Where is that limitation coming from? Is this a central problem? Is this a peripheral problem? Is this a nervous system problem? We can sometimes determine things like that.
Yeah,
So
it's just a great investigative tool.
Yeah.
All right, so misconception 2, VO2 max is mostly genetic and not very trainable. What do you think about that?
So very, very trainable. Yes, we are going to have some potential limitations on our VO2 max because of there is a element of lung capacity and other things like that. At the same time, VO2 max is milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight. One of the ways that you can increase or decrease your VO2 max is just by changing your body mass. So theoretically, as your body mass continues to decline, you're going to get a bigger VO2 max at the same relative fitness level. That being said, if you start wasting away lean muscle, you're going to have less engine for processing calories. And so, there's definitely an interplay there. But no, I would say we very rarely, if ever, really bump into somebody's physiological VO2 max ceiling. Even elite trainers can see improvements in their VO2 max with specific training to increase their VO2 max.
Yeah. At that point, it kind of is that law of diminishing returns.
Yeah. It starts to plateau for sure. From somebody that's just starting out, hasn't exercised in decades, they're going to see a much bigger climb in their VO2 max versus somebody that's a well-trained athlete. But you can still, even as a well-trained athlete, you can still see improvements in your VO2 max, and little differences mean probably a bigger leap than some of the big leaps.
Yeah.
As we're less fit.
Yeah. But, and we'll talk about some of this later. You can have people who just, hit the genetic lottery. Like,
Yeah.
There's the guy that you called the Michael Phelps of VO2 testing, right?
Yeah. He got a 95.9 VO2 max, which is off the charts, but it was because he was very in shape, very good athlete with a really large lung capacity and a very small body. He weighed 107 pounds and was 5'2", but had short legs and a long torso. And so, yeah. Michael Phelps.
He was ideally built for that.
Ideally built for crushing the VO2 max test.
But he was not the best athlete in the U.S. as a result of that.
Really good athlete, but not as great as one might think with a 95.9 VO2 max.
Yeah. And so I think sometimes it's like, people have the thought, I'll never be like that, so why try? Right? I'll never be able to be there. And there just are so many determinants of our VO2 max and our exercise performance. Again, we'll get into that later. But I think there is the reality, right? Genetics do influence, where's my starting point? There's some people that are more you see families that are more built for endurance and more built for strength, right? And it's interesting doing the different activities. You're like, oh, these people could go all day. These people cannot, but they can just have insane strength, right? It's wild. And so you may have different starting points, different predispositions, and then different ceilings. But there is so much room for improvement within whatever hand genetics has dealt us.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have said before, and there's a common saying, is that genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. And so it's like, I may have a genetic predisposition for a certain amount of capacity, but if I never train, if I never do anything, then there's actually really no way of telling it. I don't find out.
Yeah.
And
if you sit on the couch, it doesn't matter how good your genetics are, you're not going to realize the benefits of that.
Yeah. And to your point, right, it ends up being people at the elite level can still make those changes, but people that are untrained, we can see huge jumps in VO2 max in a very short period of time. And that's because our body remains highly adaptable across our lifespans.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important point to remember that, even if we're starting at a place of very low fitness, there is so much room to improve. And when we're talking VO2 max, one of the things that we like to talk about is that risk stratification. And we see people that are at the lowest score for VO2 max, poorest fitness category, moving up just one fitness category substantially reduces their risk. That's the biggest jump from the lowest category to the next lowest. And then we see further reductions in risk as we go up each fitness category. But that's a really nice thing. Like, just with some small changes, just moving up a little bit in fitness, we can see this marked drop in risk for mortality.
Yeah. Making a change really can save your life. And so when we talk about this misconception, how does KORR technology help us, the cardio coach, how does that help us kind of overcome that? It removes the guesswork by getting an accurate baseline and then being able to retest frequently and get new, accurate measures of how your VO2 max has changed. It allows us to be able to really see what is the improvement in my VO2 max and is my training that I'm doing targeted towards maximally improving it. So it really does help not only with the the assessment of it, but also the game planning for how to improve it best.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that I love. And you can show people with their actual body, like you can actually see improvements here in your body's ability to utilize oxygen for fueling performance.
Yeah. And we often will see that before we're seeing like changes on the scale.
Yeah,
Some of those external things that we
absolutely.
look to, having that data is really nice. And it's interesting because I have people ask occasionally, like, oh, like, should I even do this type of testing with people that are not very fit? It's like, absolutely. To your
Yeah,
point, like, let's get a baseline. Let's see that starting point, and then we can track progress over time really well and point out like, hey, you really improved a bunch here.
right.
Keep on that trajectory.
Right. I would say they're some of the most important people to work with and
Yeah.
get this testing done so that we help to eliminate some of the frustrations they've had before in terms of injury, fatigue, burnout. Those are always my three big, like people either get fatigued just from always working out too hard and just you kind of burn out from that.
Yeah.
Always feeling kind of crappy. And then the injury is the big limiter. Um, and so if you can avoid that you can stick with a plan, and it's the sticking with it that makes progress actually happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Consistency is crucial. All right.
Number
Misconception
3.
3. So VO2 max is the ultimate predictor of athletic performance.
Right. And we kind of already stole one of the stories that we have about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that misconception that higher VO2 max means you're a faster runner or better cyclist or better athlete or whatever, sport you play, better pickleball player or endurance athlete. So yes and no. Intra, meaning within yourself, if I improve my VO2 max, yes, that does correlate with better performance. But inter-rater, meaning in between two different people. If I take two different athletes, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a better athlete. Our 95.9 VO2 max athlete, for example, amazing athlete, awesome guy, could move like the wind, but was kind of upper middle of his track team in college. That's kind of an upper middle tier track college. So good, they're really good, and they have some athletes that do really well at national meets and things like that. But so he's kind of the top of the middle in terms of national averages of performance, even though his VO2 max is probably one of the highest in the country. And so it just goes to show that number doesn't necessarily matter when we're comparing it from individual to individual. Another great example I have is two runner friends of mine. One has a 71 VO2 max and one has a 58 VO2 max. And
Yeah.
and they and these are fast marathoners. I believe they're in the 2:19s is where both their marathon best is.
Yeah.
And so they're 17 seconds apart in their marathon best from one another, even though one has a 58 VO2 max. And I think he's like 5'8", 5'9", and 160 pounds, 165 pounds, something like that. And the other guy is like 5'11", 140 something. And so that's why his VO2 max is so much higher, even though their fitness is about the same.
Yeah.
Is that his body weight is so much lower. And so that increases your VO2 max, milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. And so that gap, 13 points sounds like a lot in terms of VO2 max, which if you made a 13-point improvement, you're going to see massive differences in your own fitness. But when comparing two people, it doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah. Well, and at that elite level, they all have sufficient VO2 max to be able to perform, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, yes, you take someone that has a VO2 max of 20 and compare it to someone that has a VO2 max of 50. Like, well, yeah, like that person can barely get past a walk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So over certain thresholds,
yeah,
that's more, you're going to see bigger differences for sure.
Absolutely. And so, but at that level, right, the elite athletes are all going to be pretty high, right? 50s, 60s, even higher.
Yeah.
And so once we've kind of leveled the playing field, I look at it like you're the like when I you get into grad school and you're like, I think I'm doing pretty well, right? Like I'm pretty smart. And then you get into the class of all the people who have done really well.
Yeah.
And I just remember I'm like, oh my gosh, like I am surrounded by all these smart people. Like,
Yeah.
do I belong here?
Right.
You
You
know?
go from feeling like one of the most capable people in your classes when you're in kind of undergrad
Yeah.
coursework a lot of the time. You feel like, yeah, I can get the high or near the high on most of my tests and I can do pretty well. And then in your grad school program, you're like, oh, I'm middle of the pack. Or,
Yeah.
but that feeling anyway is it can be overwhelming.
Totally.
And the same idea with athletes, if you're comparing your VO2 maxes, if you went around the room in a room of elite athletes, you're going to see big variations in their VO2 max score, and yet their times are probably very similar.
Yep.
Well, so and that example, if that same athlete that was at the 58, if he improved his VO2 max to be 71, he would smoke the guy that's already at 71.
Yeah.
If he made that much of an improvement in his fitness, he would absolutely destroy the other guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
So it's kind
yeah.
of how are we comparing the 2?
Mhm.
But at that level where everyone's good, we have some other determinants that come to play. So what is our lactate threshold, right? How well can we take lactate, get it out of the cell, and get it to other places it can be used? So nearby slow twitch muscle, the brain likes lactate, heart, liver, things like that. And so that will make a difference.
Right.
What's our running economy, right? How efficient are we in our movement? And then even things like at what percentage of my VO2 max can I sustain this effort?
Yeah.
Right? So you might have a really high VO2 max, but you can only, sustain high level efforts for a few minutes at a time versus someone else that can, you know, sustain the high level efforts for a much longer period of time. They're likely going to win out in the end, even if they have a lower VO2 max, but they can work at a lower relative percentage of that.
Yeah.
Then they'll often win out.
Yeah. Yeah. We see that all the time. If you have that bigger base and
Yeah.
whatnot.
Well, and I think another actually great example to get in is your grad school story about
Yeah.
having the same VO2 max and,
Yeah.
and the difference in performance.
Yeah. So, and I've told this story before. This is my favorite embarrassing story to tell. Where so when I was first doing this testing in grad school, and the kid that went before me in line, we were the guinea pigs that day, to do his test, was a former collegiate athlete. Was on the track team and was still winning like local 5Ks and 10Ks. And so, but we're like the same age, height, weight, gender, ethnicity. So he got a 62, and I was like, well, if he got a 62, I can get a 62 or 63. It was something like that. And so I hopped on the treadmill and I did. I stayed on there and killed myself until I got a 63 VO2 max. It was miserable. Like, I went white as a ghost. I almost passed out. They checked my blood sugar and gave me food to eat and all these things. Like, it was a horrible experience because I pushed it so incredibly hard to the point that it was probably dangerous.
Yeah.
Whereas he was able to hop off and be like, "Woo, that was tough," and was fine because maybe I pushed closer to my true physiological max than he did, but B, he was used to training at those ultra high intensities.
Yeah.
Right. So he had done track workouts fairly recently where he was pushing himself much closer to his VO2 max than I had probably since high school. I hadn't really done a true track workout in several years. And so um, that, that was a painful way of learning that just because we can have the same VO2 max doesn't necessarily mean we're the same athlete and have the same capacity. Because he would, at any race, at any distance, he would have destroyed me.
Yeah.
And so even though we matched on our VO2 max, I was able to attain that number performance wise, not even close.
Absolutely. Well, and so like there's the question of what's the capacity, but then like how's that capacity being used? At what percentage is that capacity being used? I think that's a great example.
Right. Well, and that's essentially what the KORR technology helps you answer is where is the capacity? Where is their ceiling? And then how efficiently are they using the distance between their ceiling and their floor, I guess, or how efficiently are they getting to their ceiling? Because if you can be more fat burning efficient higher into your heart rate range so that the gap between your really efficient training zone and your peak, that's a smaller gap, you can go much, much harder before you're actually really depleting your body of reserves and things like that. So you can push harder and perform better without the same amount of fatigue and
Yeah.
wear and tear and all those things.
Well,
Yeah.
it's super nice to have insight into those things. If you go back and check out some of the earlier episodes, I think it's episode 7 and 8, maybe, test what you intend to measure.
Mhm.
We talk about some of the long form testing you can do. And so
Yeah.
there's the VO2 max mode, the RMR mode, but then you can also do VO2 long tests, which is basically kind of playground mode.
Yep.
I can test whatever things I'm looking at over a longer period of time. And so if I want to see like, hey, I'm going to have this athlete run at this pace for 45 minutes, what happens to their fractional utilization of VO2 during that time, right? That
Yeah.
can give us a good idea. Or, how do they respond to speed, or how do they respond to incline, and changing some of those factors, and allows us to dial into what's the next change that we're going to make to improve performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Misconception 4. Only elite athletes need to care about VO2 max.
Right. Well, and a lot of our examples, unfortunately, have kind of played into that misconception even, because it's easy and kind of fun sometimes to talk about athletes. But yeah, VO2 max, we often look at that as just like an athlete thing, or we hear people say all the time, I don't need to test that. I'm not really an athlete. And yes, it does help athletes to understand their VO2 max and where their zones are getting up to their VO2 max and all those things. But it's a performance metric, yes, but it's also a capacity metric. And looking at life and lifestyle, the greater our capacity is, the more likely we are to live well and to live longer. And so it really is a very relevant tool to use, even for the average person, to understand your VO2 max and all of the data leading up to it, and what that means in terms of heart rate zones and where we should train and how to help your body function best during exercise, so that we can get the benefits of exercise and be consistent enough with it to see those benefits. And so, yes, it is a very strong predictor of long-term health and mortality, like very huge benefits for that. But no matter where we're at, if we're just starting out and those numbers don't look good, like Marc said earlier, any incremental increases in VO2 max are going to show huge positive health results.
Yeah. Well, there's this famous study. It's Blair 1989, and it's comparing BMI. Well, so it's comparing cardiorespiratory fitness to several different risk factors.
Yeah.
And so one of the charts that I like is it looks at cardiac fitness versus BMI. And so one of the things that's really stark, we see that people that are in the high BMI range, so we know that the higher BMIs tend to carry increased risk. That's a great episode to go back and check out. By the way, we talk about that it's not a great indicator of fitness or fatness, but it is a great indicator of risk.
Yeah.
And so BMI has been used for a long period of time in terms of risk. But when we look at that and compare it to cardiac fitness, the cardiac fitness wins out, which is nice because that tells us that we can have really positive changes to our risk for mortality, other things, without dropping body weight.
Right.
And so in this chart, we see that people that are in the high BMI category but have the highest fitness have markedly reduced risk compared to people that are normal body weight but have the lowest category of fitness. And it's pretty stark changes in that risk ratio.
Right. Being skinny or of normal weight but poor fitness is a much greater risk to your health than being what they call in some of the literature fat but fit. So having a higher body fat percentage but being cardiovascularly fit actually has a much lower risk to your health. And so you'll often find that I always tease that a fit plus size model is going to live a lot longer than the Instagram model with 6-pack abs. That, statistically speaking, people under a 20, 21 BMI, kind of under that 21 BMI, your risks start to climb about the same amount as those people that are above a 27 BMI. So when we look at the J-shaped curves of all-cause mortality in relation to BMI, and again, yeah, we talked about that on that other episode, but it's crazy how the risks are about the same. And so there's lots of things that we can look at to assess someone's health. And like Marc said, the being fit is one of the most important factors that we can look at. So VO2 max does matter for everyone, because the more fit we are, the more likely we are to live well and live longer.
Well, to that point, when we're looking at those scores, it's kind of putting a magnifying glass on lifestyle. We hold up VO2 as this amazing thing, and it is, again, a great predictor, but it's a proxy for what am I doing as a part of my lifestyle. If I have a high VO2 max, then it's going to involve some sort of training, right? Whether that's high intensity training or low training or some mix. We're doing something to to grow that capacity, right, and to live into that. And so when we're really low, that's probably also reflective of, well, what are my lifestyle habits? Like, I'm likely
Yeah.
not exercising regularly. I may have unhealthy eating patterns
Right.
and things that are making me less metabolically healthy.
Right. We can fix the lifestyle components that really are more important than just about anything else in terms of sticking with it, so we can be part of it for long enough to let it make a change in our life. And then it also reframes kind of the mentality. So I think that's one of the biggest ways that KORR helps beat this misconception, is that it reframes the idea of how fit am I compared to other people, which when we're not as fit as other people, then we beat ourselves up or
Yeah.
we want to quit because it's like, oh, I'm not there anyway. And it reframes that when we get a good baseline and then we retest and can see those improvements, it becomes more about how much am I improving versus how do I compare to others. And so I love that, to be able to give people real meaningful data about their body and how they've improved and what that means in terms of their improvement in longevity and fitness. And they feel it too. They feel those improvements, but being able to show them on paper and then ask them follow-up questions of like, yeah, and have you noticed that your average workout, you used to get in this many miles or this much, whatever, and now you can do double that? And they're like, yeah, actually, that's crazy to think about, but I used to only be able to do this much and now I can do this much. And so showing them how that change in VO2 max really leads to all these other areas of their life that have improved is fun.
Yeah. So I got a little question for you now with that, because
Woo.
we're talking about, baseline, and then I'm improving time over time.
Yeah.
What happens if we retest and I either didn't improve
Mm.
or things got worse? How can that still be helpful?
Well, it lets us know that whatever we did maybe wasn't the right move for where we're at right now. And so we probably either didn't follow the program or kind of misread something in the test and didn't quite do that. Or, and this is a big or, sometimes it just takes time. So it depends on the testing window and the interval that it took. Depending on how long somebody has or has not been working out. If you have been working out for a long time and you're making subtle tweaks, sometimes that can take some time before we see those things really kick in. If somebody has been doing a lot of zone 3, 4 training and no zone 2 training, and they kind of switch off, they may feel better in their joints and their this and that and the other, but we may actually see a drop in VO2 max if they have, especially if they haven't been doing enough 4 or 5 zone training. But oftentimes when people switch to doing more zone 2 training, we see a slight dip in their VO2 max. And that's just because they're doing less training kind of near that VO2 max. And so we're going to see a dip there. But what we look for then is those changes in fat metabolism in some of the other categories where it would show that metabolically they're more healthy, even though that VO2 max is 2 or 3 points lower.
Yeah.
And so that's actually pretty normal to see when somebody starts an 80-20 style program, when they've been doing more like 50-50 or 80-20 flipped. um, 2080, I guess. And so that really can be a factor that sometimes not everything works out. And so again, the key as the clinician or as the trainer on that side of the equation, it's all about asking questions and asking them, how much did you actually stick with the program? How hard was it for you to stay in that zone 2? Were you always flirting the edge or kind of going over and then looking down at your watch and being like, oh, I got to slow down? So were you not really doing the zone 2 anyway? In your zone 4 or 5 intervals, were you really pushing that hard all the way up into the zone 4 or 5 stuff? Lots of different questions that can help you ask to know, were we on program? And then if they were, and they really were doing it, and you have a way of tracking that, knowing and all those things, maybe we need to switch up what we're doing for that individual, or maybe it was, just not the right prescription for right now for them. Or maybe there's other things going on underlying that we don't understand, and we need further investigation with blood labs or other things. So
Yeah, but it just ends up being a great tool. Like, no matter what happens between test and retest, it's a really good tool to ask those deeper questions.
ask the right questions.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, misconception 5, only max effort intervals improve VO2 max. So I feel like this is one of the biggest misconceptions.
Well, yeah, and it's tricky because max intervals do have a big impact, and
Powerful stimulus.
yeah, very powerful stimulus. But with anything that has a big reward, there's also big risks typically. And so risk of injury and other things like that is higher. That being said, like within reason, and as long as you build up your capacity to do those higher intervals, you should be fine. But there's things always happen. You step in a pothole and stuff while sprinting and you just didn't see it or react soon enough or things like that. Things can happen. But yes, it's a bigger stimulus for change for sure. But no, there are actually ways to still see improvements in VO2 max by even just walking. And I've seen that with people where when we're just starting out and we don't always start with the zone 4 or 5 stuff right away, because we have to take into account that we've got to allow tendons, ligaments, bones. If somebody's quite overweight and hasn't exercised for a long time, their other tissues are not going to be ready for the volume of training that they're going to need to be able to do to effectively lose weight. And so the training volume needed to lose weight may be here, but their current capacity to tolerate that volume may be here. So before we see changes, often we need to get them attenuated to those loads and let their capacity match where they need to get to see change. And so when you asked the question earlier, what happens when we retest and there isn't much change? Sometimes that's what we're doing. In that first 6 or 8 weeks, we're just building up to where the amounts of time that they're training is actually in a meaningful range. But they may not be able to tolerate more than 5 to 7 minutes at first.
Yeah.
And so we have to build that up until every other tissue can tolerate that. Because if we just start out at like, well, research says 10,000 steps a day is where we need to be. And you start somebody out that's 2,500 steps a day at 10,000 steps a day, I can guarantee you they're going to get plantar fasciitis, or shin splints or knee pain or hip pain or whatever. They will have something like that.
Yeah.
Pop up because their feet have never done 10,000 steps a day. You multiplied their load by a factor of 4 every day, and their factor over the week by who knows how much, right?
Yeah.
And so their total accumulated load over any given period of time is way higher than what they're used to. And so we have to be careful with that load management. And so can we see improvements in their overall health and fitness? Massively. Can we see improvements even in VO2 max with submaximal training? Yes.
Yeah. Well, and to your point of I think this is such an important point about these different tissues and how quickly they adapt, because this is part of the reason that we see these really big improvements in VO2 max with high intensity training, because a lot of those changes can happen pretty quickly, right?
Mhm.
So changes in oxidative enzymes, change in the efficiency of mitochondria, neuromuscular changes, right? And those can really improve economy. They can improve how our body processes oxygen and substrate. And so that can occur relatively fast versus longer term things like growing new blood vessel networks, changing the structure of the heart, building muscle tissue. That takes longer. And if we don't appreciate that process and that it's kind of this, push and pull, we may overdo it, right? Oh, I can do this, but I can't do it sustainably. And so I've gone past the capacity of my tissues to be able to recover from. And then again, the only training that matters is training that you can recover from. And so if we're constantly digging into that recovery bucket and never able to really get the adaptations that we want, then it's kind of all for naught, right?
Right.
We start in that pain injury cycle and just go through it again and again and again.
Right. Yeah, we never get to a point where we're building up our capacity. We're always trying to get back to baseline. And so then our capacity lowers because we're always in this recovery state instead of putting just enough load that it makes us recover past where our current capacity is. So it's putting just enough load on the system that I can recover past it. But if I come down too low, I can't quite get there, and then my recovery drops to meet it, or my capacity drops to meet that.
Well, and this is another important point, because I think this is another there's a sub misconception that I'm going to talk about, is that like I get burnt out, I get injured, and I stop training. My thought is that my capacity just stays here, and so when I go back into training, I go back at that same level that got me injured. But what we haven't appreciated is, now capacity's dropped, and so that ceiling is lower, even more.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing that happens is we stop, we get injured and we drop capacity, we get injured and we drop capacity, but we keep going at the level that's the way I used to be able to do this.
Right. Oh, that's one of the most common things I hear when people start out a fitness program is they're like, well, I used to run 5 miles a day, like 4 or 5 days a week. And so I thought I'd get back into it. And so I tried just 3 days a week, but I went and ran 5 miles, 3 days this week. And now I have plantar fasciitis. It's like, well, okay. I get that you used to be able to do that, but it's been a minute. And so now you have to build back up to that. When we look at runners, especially recreational runners, Strava, that's one of my favorite things to do, because I can almost always pinpoint when the injury happened, because there's usually this big peak and then a valley, a big peak of intensity, and then they took it easy for a couple of weeks, and then they came back. Instead of just barely above taking it easy, they came back at just below where they peaked at. And and so it was either during the peak that they got injured. That's usually when they started to feel the niggle. And so they took a couple weeks off, and then they came back and started training again, kind of right where they left off. Maybe not at peak, but just below peak instead of just above the resting or the taking it easy pace. And so, or volume. And so, yeah, really common that we can just pinpoint like, and there's where it was.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Thanks for joining me on that little detour.
Yeah.
So anyway, this going back to what can improve VO2 max, even with those low intensity efforts, because we're having changes to that transport system and then how it's offloaded and used in the tissues, then that's going to improve our ability to utilize oxygen, right?
Yep.
So that's going to have effects in our ability to maximally use oxygen.
Right. So initially, especially, we'll see improvements. Long term, the volumes of low intensity, if you only do zone 2 work, the volume that you have to do of zone 2 to get improvements in VO2 max is massive volume. So long hours of just zone 2, but you can see improvements that way. The likelihood is that you're not going to see as high of a ceiling as if you did a mix of the zone 2 and the zone 4 or 5 work.
Yeah.
And so there's a trade-off for every benefit that you get.
Absolutely. Yeah. But what that tells us is that it's not either or, right?
Right.
It's both and. And I think this is, and we bring this up all the time on the podcast, but you'll see these camps that are like, nope, only high intensity. You can get everything done that you need to with high intensity. Why are we even talking about zone 2? Other people are like, no, zone 2 is magic. Like you just get like zone 2 is so important, right? That's all that I dream about is zone 2.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, but we end up missing gains on both sides.
Yeah.
And again, it's what provides the stimulus that moves me in the direction of my goals that I can consistently recover from and adapt.
So and we've talked about this before, but essentially change is driven by the amount of accumulated load on the system.
And that load can be intensity, it can be volume.
Right. It can be intensity or volume. So we can apply load this way, or we can apply load this way. We rarely can do both at the same time. Usually that leads to injury. So there's an amount of that we can do, but usually it's some of this plus some of this equals this, right? And kind of the summation of that. And so we can either improve the volume of base training or the volume of high intensity training. And what science has found is that 80-20 balance seems to be the right balance of getting enough stimulus to improve while getting enough base training to maintain those improvements and avoid injury.
Yeah.
And so that seems to be the right equation for optimal long-term sustainable improvement.
Yep. And so if we narrow into these zones, right, while only zone 2 training, might be really optimal for making us the best fat burners, or high intensity might be the most optimal training to just really shoot that VO2 max up. It's not necessarily what's most siloed alone is not necessarily what's most optimal for performance, for long-term health,
or
for
just
those things,
daily living.
or just daily living.
Right. Do you want to be the person that's super fit but can't walk up a flight of stairs, muscularly super fit, but then can't walk up a flight of stairs because your aerobic capacity is so poor?
Yeah.
Or, all kinds of examples like that. But
Well, I think even if you look into like how were we evolutionarily adapted over time, it was like lots of fairly low intensity with high intensity bursts built in,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think arguments for just only training, a small part of our heart rate range, right, which is really approximately for just training a part of our energy systems. Why would we not train across the whole range so that we get the beneficial adaptations, across that whole spread?
Right. And so how does KORR help us to beat this misconception? Is we can define where all of these zones are supposed to be. We can get true zones of our aerobic and anaerobic fitness. We can know how easy to take it or how hard to push it. So we can be in kind of those 80-20 ranges and make sure that we're getting an appropriate distribution of both the low intensity improvements as well as the high intensity training in a way that's not going to lead to injury, burnout, fatigue, illness, all those fun things. And so it makes it sustainable versus intense, but not sustainable. And so we burn out anyway.
Yeah.
Being your own fitness hero by killing yourself in the gym is probably not as successful long term as just sticking with something maybe a little more boring and mundane, but that you can do for the rest of your life and is sustainable and leads to quality results.
Yeah. Well, it also helps us avoid being trapped in that moderate intensity zone where a lot of people tend to exercise, right? They're really efficient at that range,
Right.
but long term, how sustainable is it? And being able to see this, like, no, this is where you've been exercising. We see you're super efficient here, but to move to the next level of health, to move to the next level of performance, like, this is how we're going to change your training so
Right.
that we're not just always doing that
Right.
ad nauseum.
Well, so the moderately hard all the time, we lack improvement. So I call the moderate zone the no improvement zone. And so we tend to see that drop off over time because we're not pushing improvement. And so we're not leveling off aging and some of the changes that happen with aging. And so because we can't just go moderately hard for more volume without getting injured, it makes it so that the amount of time needed in moderate intensities is actually greater than what you need in zone 2 but too intense so that you're getting injured like you would if you did high volumes of zone 4 or 5. And so it's just this in between zone where it's not really beneficial. I call it the no progress zone because it's not fast enough, hard enough to drive adaptation, and it's not slow enough to build that base of aerobic or fat burning. Aerobics may be the wrong term there, but the fat burning adaptations that we make. And so yeah, that kind of zone 3 no progress zone, avoid it so you're not always just depleted and fatigued. All right.
Yeah.
Last one or no?
I think we have a couple more.
Couple more. That's right.
Misconception 6: a higher VO2 max automatically means better fat burning. This is a big one, and this is really interesting. Is I feel like we see this identified on so many tests. People have an amazing VO2 max; they can push really hard, but you look at how they use substrate, how they switch between fat and carb, and it's like early on they switch over to almost completely carb burning, and then maintain that through the rest
right
of the test.
Right. We see this a lot in people who are like pretty fit, but not the best fitness. So like a pretty high VO2 max, but not the highest VO2 maxes that we see. And it's usually people that do a lot of kind of combining cardio and weights together, trying to get both workouts in one. Unfortunately, our bodies don't appreciate that very much. So combining cardio and weights are some of the least effective in terms of making progress, least effective workouts that we have.
Yeah.
So the kind of often gym-based class type fitness is the least effective form of fitness usually, depending on how it's based. But slow, heavy strength training is the optimal strength training. And then sustained, usually slow with some bouts of really fast cardio is the most effective way. But combining cardio and weights together, it's not heavy enough to see strength gains, and it's not slow enough to see aerobic base being built, and it's not intense enough to really see aerobic improvements being generated. And so it's kind of this in-between zone. So higher VO2 max improving fat burning, not necessarily. It can correlate if you do a big enough volume of the low intensity work, but
Yeah.
that's the key.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have enough muscle mass to drive enough calorie burn so that those numbers can be big enough.
Yeah, I think that's important, right? Like all parts of that are all parts of the system are important. So I'm going to go into the fat in just a second. I'm just going to back up a little bit because I want to talk optimal versus real life.
Mm.
Because I think sometimes the message that comes across, and I think most times this isn't done intentionally, that like if you can't do it the optimal way, then don't do it at all, right?
Mhm.
You're at a
It's
loss.
all or nothing mentality. Yeah.
The best exercise program is the one that you're going to do and the one that you're going to do consistently. And that's what's going to lead to decreased risks over time. Now, like, is it true some forms of exercise are not optimized and we're probably leaving gains on the table? Absolutely. But I want to say that it's like, while I totally agree in terms of like the strength training, in terms of the cardio, what that should look like, if, gym-based cardio strength classes are motivating enough to get you in the habit of exercising regularly, then fantastic. Like,
Right.
please exercise.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But as you're doing that and as you're finding something that you really enjoy and you can stick with, then try adding in some,
Higher volume,
higher
low
volume,
intense.
low
Yeah.
intensity. Try adding in strength training in a different way. Try some of those things out, but like find that exercise that you can sustain, that you enjoy, and that gets you bought into exercise.
Right.
If that's really a difficulty for you.
Well, and use those classes. There's definitely some good elements from things like that, especially if you do it on your own terms. If they're doing it and you feel the peer pressure to keep up with the way that they're telling you versus some of the principles you understand, like it's okay to modify what they're doing and say, I'm actually going to do fewer reps than what they're saying, but go heavier, or I'm going to do lighter intensity so that I can be more in a fat burn zone, or what. It's okay to go to those classes just to help you because you like the social atmosphere and because, it's something you'll keep doing, but then modify it to fit what your programming is, what will be best for your body.
Yeah.
So modify it so that you can still do what you enjoy and have it be as much as possible in line with what you're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. So
yeah,
why is there that misconception? And I think that's kind of like how we think of aerobic, right?
Mhm.
When we hear aerobic, we typically think, oh, that's fat.
Right.
And so I think that's where the misconception lies,
Right.
is like efforts up around VO2 max, like that's a huge oxidative stimulus, but like that system, our oxidative system, is where the most energy is produced.
Mhm.
And so it can use fat or carbohydrate as a substrate. And I think that's where it's like, oh, aerobic, oxidative, that's just fat. And the truth is that like, we create the most energy in an oxygen flame, right?
Mhm.
And so, whereas at those high intensities, I am very aerobic still. I have that oxidative stimulus. I am going to shift over to utilizing more carb, just because it's easier to
Right.
liberate energy from carbohydrate
Right.
versus fat, like incredibly plentiful. It just takes longer to process. And so,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, so Mark and I were talking about this earlier, how the term aerobic and anaerobic sometimes lead to misconceptions of you're always using oxygen when you're breaking down calories. So to burn fat or carbohydrate, you're utilizing oxygen either way. So oftentimes people think when you're anaerobic that you're not using oxygen to break down those carbs, and nope, you're still using oxygen. So the term anaerobic is a little bit of a
Misnomer.
Well, misnomer, or just it leads people down the wrong train of thought, thinking that you're not utilizing oxygen anymore once you get to where you're just burning carbohydrate. You're still using oxygen to break apart carbohydrate molecules, just like you were using oxygen to help break apart fat molecules. And so you're using oxygen for both things. You just switch substrates, but both are aerobic pathways. The anaerobic starts to creep in as we're maximizing our ability to do the aerobic work. Then those anaerobic pathways kick over more.
Yeah.
And so that for most of it, you're using kind of all three systems.
Yeah. That's like our body
fats,
is
carbs, and
absolutely is
anaerobic.
designed to use those different energy systems to create movement, to create the work, to do what we're trying to do. And so now, and so then when we're talking about becoming fat adapted, that's a different conversation, right? So if we're only training in the high intensity ranges, then we're not becoming fat adapted because we're prioritizing using carbohydrate as a fuel source, right? That's targeting that energy pathway. And so those lower intensities, still very aerobic, right? We talk about building an aerobic base, but this is also helpful because it teaches our body to utilize fat as a fuel source. Why is that important? We have a very limited ability to store carbohydrate on our bodies. So between our liver and our skeletal muscles, we have about a day's worth of calories, right? Roughly. Fat stores, even at people with very low body fat, we have days and days and days worth of calories to use. It's it's essentially an unlimited energy source.
Right. So if you take a 150-pound person with 20% body fat, you're talking close to 105,000 calories worth of fat stored on your body. Like that's pretty amazing. Like that's quite the storage form. Whereas that same person is probably somewhere between like 16 to 1800 calories worth of carbs stored on their body, of which 6 to 800 is maybe in their liver, 100 in their bloodstream at any given time, and then the remainder is kind of scattered throughout your skeletal muscles. So that's kind of the breakdown of that, where your running muscles maybe have 500 to 700 calories of carbohydrate, glycogen stored in your running muscles.
Yeah.
And so if you go out for a run and you deplete that, that's where we hit that bonk, that wall, that whatever, because we've depleted those glycogen stores there, and we're going to have to start tapping into that from liver or other sources. And the body doesn't always like to give that up right away because our brain also needs that for functioning and other things. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how that goes. But we do have a much more limited and distributed glycogen storage form versus fat, because fat is stored outside the muscle. It can be mobilized and used anywhere in the body, whereas glycogen stores that are kind of extracellular or in the muscle themselves, that's utilized locally. So once that glycogen store is in that bicep, that's where it's being used.
Yeah. No, I think that's super important to understand. And so, what we want to do is be more metabolically flexible, right? That's a term that gets thrown around.
Yep.
And that really means that our body is just able to efficiently use the best fuel source for the given intensity and the given duration of whatever activity that we're doing. And so if we have the ability to easily switch between fat and carbohydrate, that means that, like to Cameron's point, during performance efforts, we're going to be less likely to bonk. But also, we see like poor fat oxidation in people with insulin resistance. And so if we can start building those pathways and teaching the body to use fat better, like it can help reduce insulin resistance over time. And there's not as much pressure. Like we're not having to have as much insulin released to drive, carbohydrate into the muscle, because we're getting energy from a different source.
Yep.
And so whether you're healthy or whether you're metabolically unhealthy, improving metabolic flexibility is just going to give your body more options to efficiently use its energy stores and keep you going.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So I think this is our last. One point I want to hit is, again, this is like being able to measure how your body is using substrate is huge. If we're just getting and having that both the VO2 data and the CO2 data is really important, because we have an idea of if we just have the VO2, we have an idea of like, hey, we might want to train here or train here. But when we bring in that carbohydrate data and we can see how your body's using substrate,
Mm.
then we can really narrow in and selectively set those zones so that it's really driving that fat adaptation. Versus if we're lacking some of that substrate data, then it's a little less precise.
Right. Yeah. So our heart rate zones aren't going to be quite as precise, and our exercise prescription can't be quite as precise because we can't dial in calorie replacement rates, some of the nutrition information that we would base off of those burn rates, and looking at where those heart rate zones really should be based on physiological events happening corresponding to metabolic rates. And so, yeah, really, really helpful. And that's one of the things that KORR helps solve with this one is, yeah, VO2 max can mean improve fat burning, but doesn't necessarily. But KORR helps us define where we are in terms of our efficiency at fat burning, and also what to do to train to get there.
Yeah. Just one last quick thing is, we'll see those individuals who don't have great fat burning, have really high VO2 max. We also see individuals who are starting a fitness journey and like VO2 max is still not very high, but they've improved their ability to burn fat. And so just because you have a high or low VO2 max, it doesn't necessarily a commentary on what your
Wow.
ability to use fat is. Okay.
Yeah.
Last misconception. We're home stretch.
This one's funny because I had a question about this earlier today.
Yeah. So the misconception 7 is that wearable VO2 max scores are perfectly accurate.
And they are not. So yeah, the watch-based VO2 max. Somebody asked me about this earlier today. Like, are there other ways to like estimate VO2 max, or like how do the watches do? And like, can you tell just by looking at somebody? And I was like, you can't tell just by looking. It was like if I had 3 minutes with somebody's smartwatch and knew their accurate body weight, I bet I could be as close as Garmin. Just from just 2 or 3 minutes with their smartwatch and an accurate body weight, I bet I could be as accurate as Garmin, just because I've seen enough of them at this point. But the truth is, a lot of Garmin's algorithm for VO2 max, for example, is just based on your training consistency. So if you didn't wear your watch for a few weeks, but still trained just the same, and then put it back on and went for a run, it would probably, because it didn't register you as having trained consistently, it probably wouldn't give you as high of an improvement as it might otherwise do.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. I had a person that we tested the other day who his watch said like 50 something, and he tested at 30 something, like 36, I think. He was like, what the heck? And I saw the guy, and he's quite overweight and things like that, which would, just being overweight can drive that number down because of the milliliters per oxygen per kilogram of body weight. So I was like, 30, mid 30s that looks about right. And I know he runs marathons and stuff, but that doesn't always necessarily mean anything. And being 50 something is pretty high, and his marathon times and everything would equate more with a 30 something. And his watch just gave him those high scores, probably because he hadn't updated his weight in his watch for a while, but then also because he trained very consistently. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I think those things are important. And what I would say is that they often put you in the ballpark. And so it can give you,
they're usually fairly close.
Yeah. Ideas on trends. Yeah. But not necessarily like that precision.
Right.
And, great to have that number, but it doesn't always necessarily tell us what to do. Like, what's the next training decision to make, right? I have a VO2 max. That's where we want some of that other data, right? Well, how are the other systems working? How are you using fat versus carbohydrate? How consistently you're able to do this type of training? Those questions come in. And so like sometimes I think it gives us false security, right? Oh, this is what my watch says. So like, I guess I'm doing good.
Oh,
Whereas it's like, oh, there actually might be, really big gains on the table. Or taking it back to that risk stratification, each fitness category we move up further reduces our risk of all-cause mortality. And so like I might actually be able to do things to further decrease my risk, but I don't, because I'm like, oh, I guess I'm doing good enough.
Yeah. Well, I saw somebody that coaches other people just the other day, and a Fitfluencer that coaches people and does like macros breakdowns and all this stuff. And they use their smartwatch and the number of calories burned on the smartwatch to give the calorie recommendations that they're giving for their people. And I'm like, oh yeah, no. In terms of calories burned, they're quite off. So in VO2 max estimations, they're within probably 1 or 2 standard deviations of statistical significance, probably more than that in clinical significance.
Yeah.
But they're relatively accurate. But when we look at some of the other like calorie utilization, they're pretty far off usually.
Yeah. No, they're not great on that. And so this is another reason to be able to, this is more useful data that we get. So the cardio coach is what we call an indirect calorimeter.
Yeah.
As opposed to a direct calorimeter. That's basically, they put you in an enclosed room and it measures the heat that you give off.
Yeah.
And so depending on that gives us, okay, this much heat equals this many calories. There's this really strong relationship between oxygen consumed and calories burned. So roughly it's about 200 milliliters of oxygen for every calorie burned. And so we can look, we can look at that and see, okay, well, what is the VO2, right? How many liters per minute? And then because of that tight relationship between oxygen utilization and calorie burn, that allows us to get a really good idea of, okay, like at this given intensity, what is calorie burn going to look like? What can I expect with this effort? And then further, if we have that substrate data, the split of those calories burned, how much is going to be devoted towards fat, how much is going to be devoted towards carbohydrates. So that can inform, our training intensities, that can inform our nutrition. And so just having all this additional information is really nice. And the wearables just can't give us that. And as you mentioned, for calorie burn, they're notoriously not great. Fantastic for heart rate. Like they do a really good job with heart rate, but calorie burn, even step count is not always the greatest.
But relative movement.
But relative movement. Yeah.
Is pretty
But
good.
again, like obviously they're good enough that like they can be useful. And so that's
Right.
where it's like, it's putting me in the ballpark. And if it's helping me to make better decisions for my health.
Right. So
Awesome.
they're good at tracking a trend. So
Yeah.
whether it's accurate on the calories or not can be a problem if you're using that to base your macros or calorie eating decisions. But in terms of relative increase or decrease in load, it can be really helpful.
Yeah.
For those things, right?
I'm laughing because I remember this one time when I was just moving less, the watch was like, I've noticed a pattern on Tuesdays or whatever day it was. You seem to be doing much less exercise than usual. And I was like, called out. It's true. It's true.
On Tuesdays, you're a human blob.
Yeah. That was very insulting. Why did you use that? No, but yeah, no, like having that trend and seeing those changes in relative activity level or exercise can actually be really useful, can be an early warning sign like, oh, what needs to change?
Right. So I'm actually a very religious wearer of my Garmin. I absolutely love it. I think wearing a watch or some kind of smart device to track trends is really helpful.
Yeah.
So when I criticize it, I actually think they're vital.
Oh, 100%.
But at the same time, I make sure to take it with a grain of salt of what does the data really mean? How accurate is it? And how do I apply this toward just trend tracking versus absolute values?
Yeah, I think we just want to avoid over-interpreting those things. And we can kind of get some unhealthy habits of thinking or behavior around the data that we get from our watches. And we can say like, oh my gosh, like this is my sleep score. What am I doing? And then I get more stressed out.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like everything in its proper place. But one of the great things about smartwatches and things like that is it's kind of gamified fitness, right? Oh, like I got to close my rings. I got to, get all of these things done. Oh, I'm going to challenge my friend.
Right.
Like, those can all be really useful things. And so, absolutely super useful. Both you and I use fitness watches regularly.
Right.
But it's just keeping that in context and taking it with a grain of salt, like you mentioned.
Right. Well, and one of the ways that KORR can really help with this one is pretty awesome. There's a couple of things. Obviously, you can get tested and get really accurate numbers and help you dial that in. And so you can look at your average heart rate ranges and look at how many calories you actually burn and stuff. That's awesome. But KORR also makes an app that is the most accurate calorie tracker on the market because it is based on your last test. And so it's based on your body, your physiology, and your numbers. And so it's much more accurate in terms of the calorie estimation during exercise of how many calories you burn. And so downloading that can be a really helpful way at helping those numbers be more accurate. And then there also is a Garmin app as well. So for your watch, to be able to track your workouts in the Garmin app to work out with and get those accurate numbers. So that's kind of fun. So just a shameless plug there for the app and the Garmin app. But really cool tools that you can use. So one other kind of honorable mention misconception is that, and we talk about this a lot, that VO2 max declines with age. And although there is some slow decline later in life in our VO2 max, it actually doesn't have to decline as long as we stick with it, as long as we keep our activity levels and keep doing the high intensity. And I think that's probably what drops off more than anything, is we stop doing the high intensity stuff and we just do the low and moderate intensity stuff. And so then we will see a decline in VO2 max because we stop doing the high intensity work that drives improvement, which plateaus the decline, right? So we have to be improving to level out the natural decline. And so if we're not improving, then we are falling off. In all honesty, I always say maintenance is a lie.
Well, and I think when we see that, it's inevitably going down with age, but like relative to what? If I've done a really great job of maxing out my capacity, even if I see that decline, it's not moving into disability levels.
Right.
So that's what we often see is it's like, this is my, like, if you're going to decline with age, why not decline from a really high level, right? From a level with high reserve. And so typically that drop isn't as steep. And it's already higher. And so as we get to the end of life, it still allows for capability to do all the activities that one wants to do, versus what often happens is that we haven't maxed out capacity. We get to later in life, we do far less activity, right? We're not doing regular strength training. We're not doing regular, cardio exercise. And so that drops off very sharply. We lose muscle mass quickly. We lose fitness quickly. And then we get into the level of like, I can't walk up or down, right? It's like, I need to move into a new house that doesn't have stairs because I can't go up or down the stairs anymore, or I can't get out and get my mail anymore because I've dropped at such a low level that my VO2 max can't even sustain some of the activities of daily living.
Yeah. And so there's a million different examples we could make of that, but it's honorable mention there. Your VO2 max doesn't have to decline. Just stick with it. Keep doing the things to preserve it.
I was looking at a case study the other day. I think the person was like 80 something years old and VO2 max is like 51. Still. And
that's
so
awesome.
Like, amazing.
Yeah. Incredible.
All right. So thank you for sticking with us through this very long episode. But hopefully that just gives you an idea of some of those misconceptions around VO2 max and what are really the biggest levers that are going to move our training forward and allow us to adapt to whatever training volume that we have. And so VO2 max, important. We measure it for a reason, but also understanding it in context of some other things and being able to look at a broad measure of what's happening, right? That we can look at our metabolic flexibility, right? How do we use substrate during exercise, at our aerobic efficiency, at aerobic power? There's so much insight that we can glean into how our body systems are functioning through this type of testing. And so that can just help us to guide clients into being able to make the next right decision for their health.
Right. The key is that measurement matters. The more that we measure where we're at, the more we're going to get quality data, because it isn't just our lungs, but it can be our lungs. It isn't just destiny that I am predestined to have this VO2 max, that genetic lottery just gave me this. But genetic factors or elements of our build can play a factor, but let's test it and find out how much we can maximize that. And then, making sure that we understand the whole story and can, like you said, the big levers that we can pull on the right levers to get the right results for matching our training effort with our training goals so that we really can be successful. And by getting the right numbers and testing, we can do that.
Absolutely. As always, thanks for joining us. If you want more content like this, remember to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.